Shalom, and thank you so much for returning as we continue to unravel the mystery that is Daniel chapter 9, verses 24 through 27. We're looking at verses that would help lay a biblical foundation and provide understanding so that we can continue with understanding this covenant that he confirmed for 1 week. So let's go ahead and continue. The 1 week. In Daniel 9:27, it says he confirmed a covenant with many for 1 week. Now, we discovered who he was, and now we're going to see exactly what that week consists of. How does it work? And in doing this, it took some time to understand, especially the Sabbat. When you start to try to put back into practice what we should have been doing, which is keeping the Sabbat and things like that, there's always that question that comes up of, well, when do you celebrate Shabbat? Does it start, it's Friday at sundown till like Sunday before the sun comes up? Like, how does all that work? And so at first I was a little confused, trying to just pinpoint the exact minute or hour and how it all goes down, or how it all comes together. But ultimately, what the Ruach had revealed to me was that all we have to do is rely on the Bible to teach us. So I don't have to rely on my full understanding. I have to rely on the biblical understanding. And so that's why in the last video we set a foundation. And that's why I just want you to understand and know what I did. And all I did was simply take the Bible at its word. And what we're going to do is we're going to go verse by verse and take each verse and chart it on that week so that we can get a visual of how this week works. And this week is put together in reverse, because everything in the Bible is so exact and so specific. And going forward proved to be a challenge because it forced me to, it kind of almost forced me to rely on myself. But when I used the verses that was already laid out in the scripture before me, and I applied them according to the way it is in scripture, and you go backwards, you will get a very precise and exact visual of the covenant he confirmed for 1 week. What I did is, like I mentioned, I used all the verses in the Bible, and I'm going to call these verses breadcrumbs. And these are breadcrumbs that will lead you somewhere. And what it's leading us to is understanding that week. All right, so first, we're going to look at the week. Here goes your typical week. Your typical week starts from Sunday to Shabbat, which is Saturday. So here's our first breadcrumb. The first breadcrumb is early Sunday morning. The Gospels tell us that both Marys, which include Mary Magdalene and the other Mary, went to see Yeshua in the end of the Shabbat as it began to dawn towards the first day of the week. So already that's a very specific period of time. It's at the end of the Shabbat, but towards the very beginning of the week, before the beginning of the week came in, it was dawning, coming in. So let's look at that in more specifics. Now, I'm not necessarily going to read the full verses. I've included them up here if you want to look at them. We're just going to look at the highlights to extract the important information and using the breadcrumbs to put together a chart for the week. And so, like I mentioned, this is your first breadcrumb. And this is dealing with early Sunday morning. So what we have is in the end of the Sabbat, as it began to dawn towards the first day of the week. So basically, again, we're looking at the Shabbat has pretty much ended, or in other words, it's closing out. But the beginning of the week hasn't quite arrived. It's dawning. So it's that transition period. Or basically, she's here. They're both in place to see the week come in. So they got there in such a specific period of time because the week is starting to dawn and they're already there. that is according to the Gospel of Matthew. As we continue in verse 6, you're going to see, and upon their arrival, they discover he's not there. And they're told he's risen. When you look at the Gospel of Mark 16, verses 1 through 8, we're going to see, according to the Gospel of Mark, when the Shabbat was passed, Mary Magdalene and Mary, the mother of James, and Salome had bought spices that they might come and anoint him. And very early in the morning, the first day of the week, they came to the sepulchre at the rising of the sun. So it already lets you know, to be there at the rising of the sun, they basically were honestly there before the sun came in. And we have other verses that are going to explain that. But they're letting you know that this is how early in the morning they got there. I mean, they got there just before the morning crept in. But again, just like in the previous verse, even though they got there very early, he was gone. He had risen. He wasn't there. Same thing according to the Gospel of Luke. Upon the first day of the week, very early in the morning, they came with their spices, right? And they entered in and found Yeshua HaMashiach was not there. He was gone, right? They entered in and found not the body of Yeshua HaMashiach. And they were basically told, he's not here, but is risen. In the last gospel according to John, again, they came the first day of the week, and came Mary early when it was yet dark. Looks like Mary Magdalene may have arrived just before Mary, the mother of James, but nonetheless, she still arrived, right? So she arrived there when it was dark. So this is actually giving you a very precise amount of time, whether we realize it or not, because it's saying when it was dark. So before the sun even came out, before the sun dawned, so like if morning started 1 second, she was there before the sun cracked the sky. She was there when it was still dark out. That's how early she got there. Basically, the second that Shabbat ended, she was there. You couldn't have gotten there any earlier than dark. And yet, she's met with this revelation that he's gone. He's not there. So when we put it all together, the Marys arrived as the first day of the week began to come in. And when they arrived, Yeshua was already gone. Therefore, what this means is that Yeshua had already risen before Mary's arrived. He couldn't have risen on Sunday. Because again, remember, Mary Magdalene arrived at dark. She was there so early the sun had not even come in. Both of the Marys were there to see the sun come in. And yet, they still weren't early enough because he was gone before they got there. Which means he didn't rise on Sunday. Because on Sunday, he was already gone. Alright, so the next breadcrumb we're going to look at is the Shabbat. And when the Shabbat was passed, Mary Magdalene and Mary, mother of James and Solomon, bought sweet spices, and that they might come to anoint him. And alright, so the scripture tells us that they came at the close of the Shabbat, as the first day of the week began to come in. Therefore, we know the night that just closed out was the Shabbat, which means Yeshua arose on the Shabbat. So we see why Sunday he was already gone, because they met Sunday at the door. And he was already gone. So that means the day before Sunday was a Shabbat, and that's when he rose. But that's not the end of the week. So let's continue. Breadcrumb number 3. He was supposed to be buried for 3 days and 3 nights. Breadcrumb number 3 is 3 days and 3 nights. So, for as Jonas was 3 days and 3 nights in the whale's belly, so shall the Son of Man be 3 days and 3 nights in the heart of the earth. That's Matthew 12, verse 40. And then we have Luke 24, verse 7, which says, saying, the Son of Man must be delivered into the hands of sinful men and be crucified, and the third day rise again. So, we are told Yeshua was in the heart of the earth 3 days and 3 nights. So we're just going to apply 3 days and 3 nights as given to us in Scripture. So let's see what happens when we chart 3 days and 3 nights on our week. that takes us to Wednesday. Breadcrumb number 4. About the ninth hour, which you want to look into and learn about Hebrew time. The ninth hour does not mean 9 o'clock in the morning. It actually gives you about a 3 o'clock time range. What we see in Matthew 27, verse 45 to 50, and I'm not going to read it. It just says, I'm not going to read the whole thing, but it says, from the 6th hour there was darkness over the land until the 9th hour. And about the 9th hour, Yeshua cried out with a loud voice, saying, Eli, Eli, lama sabachthani. And when we skip down to verse 50, Yeshua, when he had cried again with a loud voice, yielded up the ghost. And so again, the 9th hour. So at the 9th hour, Yeshua cried in a loud voice, Eloi, Eloi, lama sabachthani. And again, Yeshua cried in a loud voice again and gave up the ghost. All this happened around the 9th hour. In other words, he died. So Yeshua dies and gives up the ghost at about 3 in the afternoon. So we're going to go ahead and chart that on our week. By 3 in the afternoon, he gave up the ghost. Now, breadcrumb number 5. He died and was buried on the day of preparation. This is where the previous video is going to come in and make a world of difference in your understanding. And this is why I like Christianity. This is where Christianity fails people, because it does not encourage people to really study the entire Bible in text. And in all honesty, it is not possible to understand the New Testament properly, or even understand half the passages in the New Testament, unless you study the Old Testament. On Luke 23, the day of preparation, so it tells us there was a man named Joseph. This man went to Pilate and begged for the body of Yeshua. And that day was preparation day. And the Shabbat drew on. And what that basically is saying is, it was preparation day, but as the day closes out, the day draws on, you're entering into evening. When evening hits, the Shabbat would start. So earlier that day was a day of preparation. But as the day continued, they're entering into the Shabbat. So he died around 3. That's not too far from your evening and from the time that the Shabbat should begin. You want to pay attention to what's going on here, because, by this point, Yeshua is dead. He has already died. Now, he is not quite Shabbat because they can't work on Shabbat. So he needs his body now so that he can basically bury the body, put the body in sepulcher. Remember, it's a day of preparation, right? The day of preparation is where they have to get everything ready on that day before the Shabbat starts, because when Shabbat hits, you can't work. So this is all the same day, because this is the beginning portion of the day towards the evening. Once your Shabbat hits, you can't do anything. Even here, what we see is the women that came with Joseph, and they saw him lay his body in the sepulcher. They returned and prepared spices and ointments and then rested. That's how close everything was. He got the body just in time. So let's keep looking at other verses. That's according to Luke. According to John. So we have the Yahudim, right? Now, because it was preparation, the body should not remain upon the cross on the Shabbat. Why? Because Shabbat was drawing near. In a few hours, it was about to be Shabbat. Earlier that day was a day of preparation. Yeshua is already dead, right? And the day of preparation, they're getting everything ready for what? The Shabbat. And he cannot remain on the cross on the Shabbat, for that was a high day. And high day we looked at in the previous video. So already this is giving us a time frame. Yeshua died about 3, but 3 was not the time of the Shabbat. But the Shabbat was coming close, and it wasn't too far away for the Shabbat to begin. But his body was already taken down, because they did not leave him up there on a cross on the Shabbat. So according to John. And even when we continue in the same Gospel of John, it even says again, Joseph, right? And Joseph begged Pilate for the body of Yeshua. And Pilate gave him the body. So they came, they took him and laid his body to rest on preparation day, because it was the Yahudim's preparation day. That's interesting too. But nonetheless, because of the Yahudim preparation day, or in other words, it was a day of preparation and it was about to start the Shabbat. So they went ahead and laid his body to rest while it was still the preparation day. And therefore we know that Yeshua died and was buried on the day of preparation. So we're going to go ahead and add that to the chart as well. So now we see that morning was a day of preparation, and Yeshua dies, or in other words, was cut off about 3 that afternoon. And this also confirms Daniel chapter 9, verses 26 through 27, where it says, after 62 weeks shall Messiah be cut off, right? And that's exactly what happened. He was cut off. When you look at the King James Version, I can't speak for other versions. I haven't really looked at the other ones, but when you look at this King James Version, it's written in an encryptic manner. Notice the 2 colons, and it says that after 62 weeks shall Messiah be cut off, but not for himself, colon. So if we pick that up, it says, and in the midst of the week, he shall cause the sacrifice and the oblation to cease. So in the midst of the week, his death is what caused the sacrifice and the oblation to cease. That's why especially Christians with the New Testament are very quick to say, we don't have to keep the sacrifices anymore. We don't do all this stuff anymore, because when he died on the cross, and that's the root of where that comes from. But actually, it's a lot more to that than they realize, and that a lot of us ourselves even realize, and that will be addressed in a completely separate video. But nonetheless, these 2 verses are connected, where it ends with 1 colon and picks up with the other colon. It all connects to that 1 week of the covenant that he confirmed with many, which is why just before those colons, or in between those 2 colons, it says, and he shall confirm the covenant with many for 1 week. So when we look at it in perspective, it says, and after 62 weeks shall Messiah be cut off, but not for himself, and he shall confirm the covenant with many for 1 week, and in the midst of the week he shall cause the sacrifice and oblation to cease. Interesting. It's encrypted and embedded, and it's a message inside of a message. And these verses, when you look at it within that context, points you right back to the 1 week covenant that he confirmed, points you right back to the Messiah. And all it does is confirm the Gospels. So some of the 2 things to take away: the prophet Daniel tells us that Yeshua was cut off, or in other words, he died in the middle of the week. He died on Wednesday. And Yeshua confirms the covenant with many for 1 week. This is the Passover week, or the Feast of Unleavened Bread. So again, this goes back to the previous videos. I was explaining it's important to have that foundation. When we have that foundation, then we understand, like I explained in the last video, 1, he died on Wednesday. That is the middle of the week. And this is just a regular random week. Any random week that we have always has a middle of Wednesday. But during that random week happened to also be the Passover week. As we explained, Passover and Feast of Unleavened Bread, they're pretty much called Passover or Passover week. So out of this random week where he died on Wednesday, during that same random week was the Passover week. So you're almost kind of talking about 2 different things. He died on Wednesday of a random week, and on top of that, the other week is Passover week. So you're dealing with just your common regular week, and then a special week, a Sabbat week, a very special week. So we have to kind of divide and separate those 2 to understand that they both happen at the same time, but they're kind of talking about the week in 2 different perspectives. And again, as we said, your typical week is Sunday through the Shabbat, and in the middle of that week is Wednesday, and that is when Yeshua died, or was cut off at about 3. Now let's look at the 6th breadcrumb, buried just before the Shabbat, because we kind of already looked at that previously. But again, when we look at the Gospel of Luke, right, Joseph, he begged Pilate for the body of Yeshua. And it was the day of preparation, and the Shabbat drew on. So they were about to enter into the Shabbat. That was why it was very crucial and important to get the body down before the Shabbat. We know it's the same day because pretty much as soon as the body was laid to rest and the women saw that his body was laid, then they prepared spices and ointments and rested according to the commandment. Now, this is in the New Testament. Keep that in mind. And Yeshua died. Because they could have said, well, he just died, so I guess we don't have to keep the Shabbat no more. But they didn't. Even after his death, they still kept the Shabbat. But that wasn't the point I was making. Nonetheless, what we're ultimately saying is that it's only within a few hours, possibly, or probably shorter than that. But it wasn't long from when he died around 3 to when the Shabbat just started. Because if it were the next day, it wouldn't be nearly as much of a rush as it is when it, it's like, oh man, he died and we're about to enter into Shabbat shortly after, because they just saw his body laid. Yet they went to go rest for the Shabbat. So it lets you know how close all these events are transpiring. So therefore, we know that he was buried just before Shabbat. He could not have been buried on Shabbat because they can't work in the Shabbat, and they obviously honored the Sabbath. So we know that Yeshua was buried just before Shabbat. That even tells us that in Mark 15, where it says, and know when the even, which is evening, was come, because it was the preparation. That is the day before Shabbat. Now this one too requires some understanding, because as we can already tell, he died at about 3, and they had to hurry up, get his body down. As soon as they got his body down, they went to rest for the Shabbat. All of this happened in a very short time span. It wasn't like a whole nother 24 hours. So in other words, there's the day, as in, you have to understand the concept of the day, the morning time, or not just the morning, but just the course of your day before evening hits. So it can still be within the same 24-hour time span, but you have the morning part of the day, even the afternoon part of the day, and then you have evening. Same day, but the evening started the Shabbat. So when they're saying the day before preparation, they're defining and explaining to you that the preparation comes before the Shabbat, because you have to be able to get things ready. And this wasn't like 24 hours prior, because again, as soon as he died at about 3. They had his body laid, then they had to get ready for the Shabbat. All this happened in the same day, in the same time span. And that's why they had to hurry to do it. So in this context, when it's telling you the day before, it meant the earlier portion of the day before evening, because once evening hit, it was a Shabbat. Then we have John 19, which says, the Yehudim, therefore, because it was the preparation, that the body should not remain on the cross on the Shabbat day, for that Shabbat day was a high day. And I know we're kind of re-looking at these verses, but you have to look at them at all these different angles. So again, it was preparation. That's when he died, a preparation day, around 3. And yet they had to get him down because he couldn't be up there during the Shabbat. All right, so we're going to go ahead and chart that. Since we've already understood the high day, because we read our Torah and looked at how that all works, then what we're going to understand is that he died on Wednesday, and preparation day was earlier that day. And if Wednesday is a Shabbat, it could not obviously be your weekly Shabbat that happens on what we call Saturday. It had to be the high day Shabbat, which meant that that day was the 15th Nisan, or the Abib, as in the commandments. So then what was the day prior to that? So let's keep going. But right now, we understand that he not only died on Wednesday, not only the preparation day, but it was the 15th of Nisan, or the 15th of Abib. And this was the first day of the Feast of Unleavened Bread. So breadcrumb number 7, Yeshua ate Passover Tuesday evening. So therefore, since we understand that he died on preparation day, and then he was buried shortly thereafter, or laid to rest shortly thereafter, that evening, just prior to the Shabbat, because they had to celebrate the Feast of Unleavened Bread, that means the day prior to that was Passover. So we know that Yeshua ate Passover Tuesday evening. They prepared earlier that day, and at evening they ate. We know it's Tuesday because it's celebrated the evening before the Feast of Unleavened Bread, which is a high Shabbat day, or high day. and this is how we know. So when we look at Matthew 26, verse 17 through 20, I'm not going to read all of it. We're just going to hit the highlights. And now, the first day of the Feast of Unleavened Bread, and we understand that's kind of interchangeable too, because the Feast of Unleavened Bread can also be referred to as the Passover as well, but commonly it's called Passover week, but they're interchangeable. The only way to understand what specifically they're talking about is to kind of read it all in text and also have that understanding of how it all works. So again, now on the first day of the Feast of Unleavened Bread, the disciples came to Yeshua, saying unto him, Where wilt thou that we prepare for thee to eat the Passover? So again, they just said it was the first day of the Feast of Unleavened Bread, but yet they're preparing for Passover, because again, we have to understand they're not specifically talking about the Feast of Unleavened Bread. They're actually referring to the very first day, which is the Passover day. And he said, Go into the city to such a man. And he said unto them, The master saith, My time is at hand. I will keep the Passover. Again, if they're talking about the Feast of Unleavened Bread, why is he talking about keeping the Passover? Because in essence, they were actually referring to getting prepared and starting the Passover, which will lead into the Feast of Unleavened Bread. So I will keep the Passover at thy house with my disciples. And the disciples did as Yeshua had appointed them, and they made ready the Passover. So again, that's why context is important in understanding the Old Testament and how all of this works to make proper sense of everything. So in other words, they came to Yeshua so that they know where to start to prepare so they can start the Passover, which of course leads into the Feast of Unleavened Bread. And it says, Now when evening was come, he sat with the 12, and as they did eat. Or basically, when evening came, he sat with the 12 and they ate. So already we see that at evening was Passover. So again, the same day, earlier that day, was the preparation for Passover. And then when evening happened, they ate Passover. And I know, and for those who have been reading into the Old Testament, the way Passover worked is it starts at evening, but they were not to have anything left over in the morning. Or if nothing else, what we do know is that Passover was that evening. Earlier that day, they prepared. Passover was that evening. Now, Passover is not a Sabbath. It is not a Sabbath, but it is a day to be celebrated, and we are commanded to recognize it. And they prepared earlier that day, and by evening, they were eating Passover. And that was breadcrumb number 7. And as I pointed out with Luke 22 verse 1, now the Feast of Unleavened Bread drew nigh, which is called Passover. And so it's kind of interchangeable, as we just saw in the previous verse. All right, so let's go ahead and chart that. So when we chart it, what we have is the preparation was that morning for Passover, and by evening they were eating the Passover meal. And during this Passover, something interesting that happens. What you see is, as they were eating, and Jesus took bread and blessed it and brake it and gave it to the disciples and said, Take, eat, this is my body. And he took the cup and gave thanks and gave it to them, saying, Drink ye all of it, for this is my blood of the New Testament, which is shed for many for the remission of sins. But I say unto you, I will not drink henceforth of this fruit of the vine until the day when I drink it new with you in my Father's kingdom. Now, he said a lot right here, but the highlight of that verse is in verse 28. For this is my blood. That's a blood covenant with the New Testament. And you can read more about blood covenants, I believe, in Leviticus. I'll put the verses up for you. But nonetheless, he said, Drink. This is my blood of the New Testament, which is shed for many for the remission of sins. So he made a blood covenant, which is the new covenant, which was for many. He confirmed the covenant with many. And what this means, this is not in no way saying that the old covenant is void and does not matter anymore. He has not come to abolish the law, but to fulfill it. The old covenant was a promise made with the Israelites, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And that's the core of what Daniel 9, verses 24 through 27 are about. The new covenant, grafted in the Gentiles amongst the old covenant, which is the covenant with the Israelites. That's what this is about. It is not saying Israelites don't matter anymore. It's not saying the Old Testament does not matter anymore. What it's saying is it brought the Gentiles amongst the Israelite fold. So when Christians feel that they don't need to keep Passover, why would you not want to keep it? Because this is a confirmation that allowed you to come in amongst the Israelites. 1. 2, the scripture tell us that there is no distinction, and Christians love to throw this out there. There's no distinction, but yet they love to make sure to let you know, I'm a Christian. I'm a Christian, but there is no distinction. And then they'll say, oh, well, we're Gentiles and we're of the seed of Abraham too. The seeds of Abraham that have the promise over them, because Abraham has lots of children, but there's the seeds of Abraham that have the promise over them, are Israelites. If you are grafted in amongst them, if you are now the seed of Abraham because you believe in Yeshua HaMashiach, then that makes you the seed of Abraham and heirs according to the promise. That means you are an Israelite. That means you have to stop making the distinction that you are the Christian, because it does not say if you believe in Yeshua HaMashiach, you are a Christian and they are Israelites. It says there is no distinction. It says that you are the seed of Abraham and heirs according to the promise. That means you are an Israelite. You have been adopted as an Israelite. And you have to stop making the distinction. It's not us making the distinction, it is you. We are telling you we are Israelites. We let you know that you can be grafted in amongst us. Therefore, when you come in amongst us, you can't keep your Christian ways and you can't keep saying you are a Christian. Remember, the term Christian was it was a derogatory term that Gentiles gave people. Nowhere does it say that Israelites gave that name. Now, the one verse of all the verses in the Bible, it basically says, if you suffer for being a Christian, you have to read that in context. And what he's talking about is he's not calling you a Christian. He's just saying that other people are calling you a Christian and they're abusing you because of how they see you. You have to understand that. It's very crucial. So if you're going to say that you're the seed of Abraham and heirs according to the promise, if you're going to say there is no distinction, then stop making the distinction and start to accept the fact that you, Christian, are actually an adopted Israelite. We have to understand that. Stop contradicting the Bible. And I say that in love and with love. I don't hate you. And the reason I have to address Christians is because of how close it comes to proclaiming to be of the faith of Israel and of the house of Israel, but yet so far. And I don't want to take away from what we're talking about here, but the point that I'm making is that this verse, and a lot of these verses, the Old Testament and Daniel chapter 9 and other verses, but Daniel chapter 9 and Matthew 26, just in these two verses, should give you reason to keep Passover. Because the Passover was when Yeshua confirmed that he brought you guys into our fold. So let's go ahead and keep going. Now we can make sense of Daniel 9:27. So after looking at everything in Matthew, looking at what transpired at that Passover and how he basically confirmed a blood covenant, because the next day he was going to go shed his blood. All right, and we're not done with the week. So now we come to our 8th breadcrumb. After 2 days is Passover. As we established, Passover was on Tuesday. Then when we look at the Gospel of Matthew 26, and it came to pass, when Yeshua had finished all these sayings, he said unto his disciples, Ye know that after 2 days is the feast of Passover, and the Son of Man is betrayed to be crucified. And then we have in Mark 14, verse 1 through 2, after 2 days was the feast of Passover, and of unleavened bread. And the chief priests and the scribes sought how they might take him by craft. By craft, they're crafty, right? And put him to death. But they said, not on the feast day, lest there be an uproar of the people. Crafty counsel. But nonetheless, the point is, after 2 days was the feast of Passover. So now you're charting in time. If the Passover was on Tuesday, but this was stated that after 2 days is Passover, then this happened on Sunday, Monday, Tuesday. This transpired on Sunday. So we're going to chart that. I can't exactly say the time frame, but it appears that it may have happened in evening, because again, 2 days after that is Passover. Whether it's 2 evenings or 2 mornings, you still have Passover. So therefore, it's charted this way. And we're going to go ahead and continue. And the last breadcrumb we have is breadcrumb number 9, where Yeshua is anointed for burial. Now, when you read these passages, you're going to see that this happened after the proclamation or the statement about Passover will be in 2 days. Now, I was not able to find exactly what day this transpired. It appears that it may have happened at evening because Yeshua was reclining at the table. It appears that he may have been eating. So, nonetheless, we know that it was first declared that Passover would be in 2 days. After that, Yeshua was anointed. So we have a woman with the alabaster box, and she anoints Yeshua to prepare him for burial. And he even confirms it. He basically, he's the one that says that she does this to prepare me for burial. So that may have happened whether it's Sunday or Monday. It happened on one of those 2 days. But ultimately, from the start of the week on Sunday, he already confirms that Passover is going to be in 2 days. He already declares Passover is going to be in 2 days. From that point, he's anointed to be prepared for burial. All right, so let's go ahead and look at the week in review. And what we see is that on Sunday, Yeshua was already gone. He rises on the Shabbat, and 3 mornings and 3 nights pass. He is buried just before the Shabbat. He dies at about 3, and this happens on Preparation Day. He dies in the middle of the week on Nisan, the 15th of Nisan, or the 15th of Abib. And then by Tuesday evening, he has already eaten Passover. That morning, they were preparing for the Passover. And then just prior to that, on Sunday, they already said that Passover would be in 2 days. And after that was stated, the one with the alabaster jar or alabaster box prepares Yeshua for burial. All right, so in essence, we have to go backward to move forward. Ultimately, this is the week that he confirmed with many, as mentioned in Daniel chapter 9, verse 27. Thank you so much for your time, and take care.